Thank you very much, Miraban. Just before I start the lecture, Gunesh came to me with an innocent question.
Yes.
Did I think it would be a good idea to have an online conference on the Neolithic? Yes, I said, good idea. Then he comes back 1 week later and says, will you do the first paper? Well, if you insist, yes, okay. But now I learned that you wish to dedicate this to me. And I have to say that I'm amazed and I'm humbled. And I want to say thank you to Miraban and Gunesh for the great honor that you've done me. And I'm deeply, deeply grateful. And I'm now going to share the screen and hopefully we'll get into the lecture. Okay, can everybody see the first screen?
Yeah.
I believe that we have a great story to tell about our Epipalaeolithic-Neolithic in Southwest Asia, and I do prefer to put the Epipalaeolithic and the Neolithic together because I think they're part of the same story. But I think we're failing to put that over both to the wider scientific public and to the wider general public. And the danger is that if we don't tell that story, then we leave it to others to do it for us. We compete against an ill-informed public. Many people, and you will have all seen examples of this, and too many writers learned about the Neolithic when they were at school, where they were taught by teachers who in turn had learned it from their school books. And for many people, the Neolithic means the time when people finally escaped the age-old hand-to-mouth existence of the nomadic hunter-gatherer and at last began to live by farming. Together with the Epipalaeolithic, the Neolithic represents, in fact, a major social and cultural transformation that is foundational to all of succeeding history. There is a multitude of facets to that transformation, so there are many ways of spinning the story, but it is much more than simply the story of how farming replaced hunting and gathering. I think that we archaeologists have been very understandably focused on resolving the problems immediately before our eyes, like working out how the stratigraphic units on our site relate to the established regional cultural sequence, for example. So we have been slow to recognize the drawbacks inherent in the interpretive frameworks that we've inherited. For example, a great deal of time and effort is put into defining the blocks of time in our cultural sequences. Kathleen Kenyon left us a simple two-stage pre-pottery Neolithic period based on the Jericho stratigraphy, and she defined in the 1950s, and beneath that she found a base on the Tufian, which linked the pre-pottery Neolithic back to the Epipalaeolithic. That set of boxes has been successively refined into two sub-periods within the early pre-pottery Neolithic and four sub-periods within the later pre-pottery Neolithic, and then earlier phases in the Epipalaeolithic before that. But that is only like the historian's basic task of establishing the sequence and the reigns of rulers in a dynasty. It doesn't tell the story. And in fact, if anything, that static pile of boxes makes it more difficult to think of the culture sequence, the culture historical processes of change and development across that time range. We encounter another deficiency in our inherited framework of reference when we look for an explanation of change as a significant, of a change as significant as the adoption of cultivation. The simple idea has long been that such a change is the adaptation to some external pressure. Was it driven by the downturn of the environmental resources with the Younger Dryas climatic reversal? And many of you will be familiar with this series of maps, so here they're rather dramatically colored. Or was it inevitable population pressure on the available natural resources? The subsistence strategies and the environment are of course important, but not all important. And such simplistic accounts do not explain the transformation that we see documented in the archaeological record. Way back in 1986, Colin Renfrew warned us of the danger of assuming that cultural change must have an exogenous, i.e. an external causal factor. Change could also be endogenous, generated from within. It could be systemic, That is, which is very important. Change can be brought about, as he argued in his introduction to peer-polity interaction as a theory.
Trevor,
Yes.
Could you please make a full screen?
A full screen.
Yeah, and your PowerPoint.
How's that? Is that better?
Thank you, great.
Okay. And what he meant was that there is no scientific or single identifiable single cause within the system. The causes are the interrelations between the components within the system. It's difficult to comprehend, difficult to disentangle the threads, but Renfrew's formulation of a peer-polity interaction sphere, I think, is a valuable model. Archaeologists have always been borrowers, whether of tools for excavation or of ideas and analytical methods. Near the beginning of my career, radiocarbon dating was soon followed by radiocarbon calibration curves, and that meant learning to talk to physicists and learning about radioactive isotopes of carbon, radioactive decay, half-lives, and probability statistics. In the mid-20th century, archaeologists also had to learn something about botany and zoology if they were to be able to converse and understand the revelations that were being discovered by the pioneer archaeobotanists and archaeozoologists. But at the present time, I think that archaeology has a great opportunity to do more than borrow or import. Archaeology has begun to be an active and positive component in developing and implementing new interdisciplinary theories of cultural and social evolution, making it a two-way process. The evolutionary scientists need the archaeology as much as their evolutionary theories enrich our archaeology, and that presents us with a great opportunity. We must be confident that our Epipalaeolithic-Neolithic has many stories worth telling, and that there are people who would be very interested to hear more. I will offer you two examples which should encourage us to reach out to the wider world. This is a book by a man called Daniel Lord Smale, who's a medieval historian who has taught Western civilizations courses for many years in an American university. But he wanted to set the story of Western civilizations in a truly deep history. Deep history echoes the idea of deep time, which refers to the dawning revelation of the enormity of the geological timescale amongst the first scientific investigators of the geological past a couple of hundred years ago and more. In his book, Daniel Lord Smale differentiates between Pleistocene human history and what follows the Neolithic. As you see from these two short quotations, Smale's grand historical narrative of the whole of human history pivots about the Neolithic. What came after the Neolithic as a consequence of the Neolithic was of a different order from all that went before. He refers to it as the fulcrum of the Great Transformation, the point at which the Neolithic levered human progress into something different. Second example is the book by Paul Seabright, very successful book, very widely read, The Company of Strangers. Paul Seabright is a British-born professor of economics at the University of Toulouse. And the book is concerned with, and I quote, the remarkable strangeness and fragility of our everyday lives in contemporary urban society. And he recognizes that today's economic and social world can only be explained by understanding how it has come to be that way. My quotations are taken from the opening page of his preface. So he is interested in how human societies have evolved the ability for abstract reasoning that has allowed them to devise all kinds of institutions like money and markets and marriage and cities and representative democracy and even free and fair elections that provide the foundations of social trust on which an extraordinary scale of the human world today depends. The extraordinary experiment that he alludes to is our Neolithic of Southwest Asia. He contrasts the time before the Neolithic with the time since, amazed at how the sedentary populations of the Neolithic, and I quote again, with barely a pause for breath in evolutionary time, had formed social organizations of startling complexity, and so on. So I want to try to do the same kind of thing, but from within archaeology, within the archaeology of the Epipalaeolithic-Neolithic. In the context of this lecture, I can only talk about how I'm trying to frame a new kind of account of a critically important pivotal point in human social and cultural evolution. Necessarily, this is a very abbreviated version, but I hope that it can illustrate how we can talk about our rich and exciting Neolithic to a wider scientific audience. There are, I will suggest, three key features to the story of the long term of human evolution. Whoops, coming in. And accumulated work by a number of biologists, anthropologists, and evolutionary theorists has shown that the mechanisms of cultural evolution can frame that story of human evolution. By setting our Epipalaeolithic-Neolithic transformation in its place within the long-term story of cultural evolution, and then setting it within a framework of contemporary cultural evolutionary theory, I think that we can explain the importance of our period in the terms of cutting-edge evolutionary theory. Research on hominin evolution shows us three interrelated, slow but accelerating trends over the 2 or 3 million years. In cultural innovation and change, in the expansion of the range of cultural products and skills and capacities. I think I've gone too far. Hang on, let me just go back. No. This we've done. Accelerating cultural innovation and change, expansion in the range of cultural products and skills and capacities, and thirdly, the growth in the scale of human societies and population density. Those three things go together and help to frame the story of human evolution. Now we can move on. And for example, see the work of Robin Dunbar, and he's the gentleman with the glasses at the back of that picture. And he showed that there is a relationship between the increasing size of the primate brain in primate species, and in particular the crinkly outer cortex, and the size of social groups in the various primate species. Those are the black discs in this graph there. Fitting hominin brain size, changing hominin brain size over the 2 or 3 million years of evolution, and particularly the ratio of the outer cortex into that graph, and that's the open circles in this graph. Dunbar suggests that the evolution of the hominin brain has co-evolved with the growth in the size of social groups. The larger the social group, the more complex the web of personal relations, and the greater challenge to the mind to keep track of all those relations, and indeed to be able to manipulate them. In this second graph, Dunbar shows the size of human social groups on the vertical scale against time, going from right to left. This is the basis of his social brain hypothesis, relating brain size and cognitive sophistication to the size of hominin social groups, arguing that these have co-evolved in the process, as we saw. Dunbar argues Homo has also evolved the unique human faculty of language. So what Dunbar has been talking about is much more complex than this two-dimensional graph shows. It's a complex process involving cumulative gene-culture co-evolution, positive feedback loops involving things like extended human infancy, plasticity of the human brain, expansion of its cognitive capacities, capacity for mind reading, size of the human social group, language, all sorts of things. Behind that graph then, there is a very complex set of co-evolutionary processes that I want to emphasize but here, what I want to really emphasize here from this graph is that there is clearly an acceleration from right to left, an acceleration through time, an upward curve in that graph. There's an accelerating there's accelerating tempo in the rate of human evolution. Here's another example with a similar kind of graph. Time goes from right to left. And in this example, Dietrich Stout and his colleague Thierry Chaminade argued that cognitive skills, language, and the abilities to accumulate a sophisticated cultural package of stone tool-making skills have co-evolved. Again, the graph shows an accelerating curve through the long term of the Pleistocene. But here, what is graphed is the increasing flexibility of tool-making technology. This research adds practical and conceptual cultural knowledge to the equation of co-evolution of cognition, scale of social group, language, and culture. And now I want to suggest that we can see those same three characteristics of hominin evolution operating within an Epipalaeolithic-Neolithic transformation, but at a rate of acceleration that is completely new. The relatively sudden and dramatic acceleration sets the scene for all that follows in human cultural evolution. Hence, the fulcrum of the Great Transformation, that subtitle that I borrowed from Daniel Lord Smale's book. These characteristics are, as we saw for the long term, acceleration of the rate of cultural change, expansion in the range of cultural products, skills and capacities, and growth in the scale of human societies and of population density. The accelerating rate of cultural change is implicit in the way that we archaeologists have defined our successive archaeological periods in terms of their material culture. Against the Middle Paleolithic, the Upper Paleolithic is much shorter, but against the Upper Paleolithic, the Epipalaeolithic is half the length. And in the Levant, it is broken down into three main subperiods. And the phases within the pre-Pottery Neolithic are shorter again, where we count in tens or even hundreds of thousands of years at the beginning of that sequence in the Middle Paleolithic. We count in centuries for each of the subperiods towards the end of the Neolithic. The material culture repertoire also can equally be seen to expand over time, and over the pre-Pottery Neolithic, new skills were being added. We can get a proxy handle on the growth of population and population density by means of occupation sites and settlements. Annabel Vercoen and Nigel Goring-Morris brought together the data on a number of sites in different parts of Southwest Asia between the beginning of the Upper Paleolithic, around 50,000 years ago, and the late Neolithic, around 8,000 years ago. The numbers of sites were normalized relative to the duration of each subperiod, and the best data comes from the southern Levant, where there has been most work over at least a century. Over recent decades, there has been a concentration of salvage archaeology in the upper Euphrates and Tigris regions. Although we don't have early sites, Epipaleolithic and earlier prehistoric sites from this region, the trend from the beginning of the Neolithic is actually quite similar to that from the southern Levant. Both curves, in fact, underplay actual population growth because across time, A, sites grow larger with time, and B, they become more permanently and then completely permanently occupied, and C, our archaeological periods are getting shorter and shorter from left to right across this diagram. Ian Kite collected data on settlement size for the southern Levant. From the beginning of the pre-Pottery Neolithic, site size increases at an accelerating upward curve. He also collected information on the ratio of built space to open space, which shows that as settlements grew in size, so did the density of buildings within them. Whatever the means by which they assured their internal social cohesion, our Neolithic communities did not exist in isolation. We've known for a long time about some elements of their systems of exchange by means of the circulation of Anatolian obsidian. We also know that the connectiveness, the connections that made up this extensive network were already in existence in the Epipaleolithic period. And there is a steady crescendo in the amount of obsidian and in the range of other materials in the network through time. But the recent work by a Spanish group has shown that simple down-the-line trading of obsidian does not work. Instead, they found that a small world network in which some participants accessed distant links, exchanging with partners up to 180 kilometers away from their home, worked much better. And the best fit to the archaeological distribution map for the later pre-Pottery Neolithic is called optimal distant link networking, in which certain communities emerge as significant distribution centers. And these distribution centers obtained their obsidian direct from other centers that were nearer the Anatolian sources. In other words, the Spanish group are proposing that there came into existence through the early Neolithic complex and hierarchical systems of interaction and exchange of symbolically important materials, genes also through exchange of marriage partners, and the pooling of ideas, innovations, and experiences. We Neolithic archaeologists tend to think in terms of the autonomous community represented by the single settlement site. We should be thinking in terms of super communities made up of networked settlements. Something else was new in the Neolithic, emerging out of Epipalaeolithic prototypes, monumental community architecture. Because of its recent publication, Jaffa al-Ahmar offers the best example. This small settlement site beside the Euphrates in North Syria was never occupied after the early pre-pottery Neolithic. Daniel Stauder was therefore able to expose a lot of the settlement of that early pre-pottery Neolithic period. In an early phase of its existence, at the center of a cluster of buildings was this massive subterranean construction, 7 meters in diameter and 3 meters deep into the ground. The excavators have inferred that the cells had served as a storage facility for the community's cereals and pulses. Around the communal storage building, there were several communal kitchen buildings equipped with multiple grinding stones. In this example, the grinding stones have been removed, and you can see the support stones that held them in place. So although the community was larger than a typical mobile forager band, and although they were already engaged in the cultivation of some cereal crops, the community seems to have continued the sharing ethos of hunter-gatherer societies. Indeed, their communal food storage facility was monumentalized in this massive central building. But the most dramatic example of monumental architecture and sculpture is the site of Göbekli Tepe, which, as Klaus Schmidt saw it when he first arrived there, was on a bare limestone mountain ridge near Urfa in southeast Turkey. I don't think it looks like that now. The now famous large circular buildings in the earlier phase of the site date to the early pre-pottery Neolithic, contemporary with the settlements like Jaffa al-Ahmar that have similarly monumental communal buildings. Göbekli Tepe seems to have functioned as a central place. The excavator, the late Klaus Schmidt, compared it to the neutral ceremonial meeting place of an ancient Greek amphictyony. Now we're back at Jaffa al-Ahmar, where Daniel Stauder found the first of these small stone plaques. Each would fit comfortably in the palm of your hand. The grooved stones at the top are typical of the end of the Epipalaeolithic and the beginning of the Neolithic, but these plaques in the lower part of the picture are different, having motifs incised on both flat surfaces. We now have examples of these small stone plaques with motifs on them from a number of other sites in southeast Turkey and northern Syria. And it seems that the motifs, I suggest, are signs that are elements in what is called a semasiographic sign system. That is, a writing system whose signs are symbolic rather than logographic, i.e. referencing words or syllables or sounds. Like the early American civilizations, contemporary mathematicians and theoretical physicists, and this is a former colleague of mine at Edinburgh University, Peter Higgs, who, as you probably know, got a Nobel Prize for his physics, with a blackboard full of the kind of things which he understood and his colleagues could understand. Such sign systems, non-verbal sign systems, non-logographic sign systems can function very well as modes of storing and sharing complex information. We can say that in the early pre-pottery Neolithic, there were regional networks of communities whose shared cognitive frames made their groups of carved signs meaningful to them. Within each community and among the communities that together made up the super community, these, from monumental communal architecture to small handheld plaques bearing signs, these were the means of ensuring what Jan Assmann has called cultural memory. Now, a sudden shift of subject. Over the last 20 years or so, evolutionary theory has been expanding and diversifying quite radically. Under what is generally called the extended evolutionary synthesis, there are three components that are very important for thinking about cultural evolution. Gene-culture co-evolution, we have already seen in Dunbar's social brain hypothesis. We could also see examples in the way that some peoples who have relied heavily on milk in their diet have become evolved to be able to tolerate milk in adulthood, whereas many other human populations don't tolerate milk very much as adults. The second component is niche construction, in its particularly human form of cultural niche construction. In common with many diverse kinds of organisms, humans operate within a niche which they themselves have formed and which becomes the effective environment that accommodates them and to which they accommodate. Biologists are interested in the backwards and forwards interaction between human practices and the biology of humans and the species that humans have taken into their cultural niche with domestication, for example. Psychologists are equally interested in the ways that the humanly constructed niche affects our cognitive functioning. We have learned to read and write, for example, and developmental psychologists have shown that the practice of reading actually changes the way that the brain works. The third element of cumulative culture, the third element in the scheme is cumulative cultural evolution, which is practically unique to humans. We are practically the only species that have evolved forms of cultural niche which enable people to transmit cultural knowledge with great accuracy and skills as well by teaching and learning, and collectively accumulate new cultural innovations. Kim Sterelny is the author of this book, is an eminent philosopher who is interested in evolutionary theory, and in particular human cultural evolution. In his book, The Evolved Apprentice, Kim traces the long-term development of cooperation and the evolution of social and cognitive skills embedded in a cultural niche adapted for cultural transmission. Certainly by the time of Homo sapiens, young people had become very adept at working out who were the best teachers from whom to learn advanced cultural skills. And there were cultural norms that enabled skilled and experienced older people to transmit their skills, what Sterelny calls apprentice learning. Homo sapiens cultures of the Upper Paleolithic were already highly sophisticated, complex, and diverse. And there, just briefly, a quotation from his book, central aspect of the process, increasing tendency to shape our environments and not just to respond to them, etc. On the basis of teamwork in ethnographic fieldwork and intensive laboratory experiments, Joe Henrich argues similarly for the power of this cultural learning niche for the safe intergenerational transfer of complex knowledge and diverse skills. The cultural accumulation of innovations is likewise dependent on the existence of a very cohesive social group and a cultural niche that provides for the tutoring, acquisition, and practice of complex skills. Let me turn over my notes. There is a demographic component in this advanced cultural learning niche. There has to be a relatively large number of people if there are to be among them several wise and experienced practitioners of complex skills, such as, and this is something that Joe Henrich quotes, the skills of building a kayak, making a harpoon, and engaging in seal hunting in the Arctic Ocean. Henrich announces that he has learned that, quotes, cultural evolution became the primary driver of our species' genetic evolution. Cultural evolution became the primary driver. Those are his italics. The process, he says, can be described as autocatalytic. In other words, it becomes a process which, where the interaction fuels the onward process itself. The multiple positive feedback loops produce a runaway, that is, an accelerating process. The Upper Paleolithic societies, made up of scattered small forager bands, were very successful, but they were at the limits of their cultural capacity to sustain sufficiently large numbers of people who could maintain meaningful contact with one another. At this point, I could have turned to another major recently published book, but Robert Boyd's A Different Kind of Animal. It derives from a prestigious series of lectures at Harvard University and is founded on more than 30 years of collaborative research, which has demonstrated the importance of the relationship between culturally transmitted information and population dynamics in human evolution. The quotation on the screen is taken from the introduction to the lectures in the book, and I'm showing you this only to emphasize that I'm not relying on a single book by some particular scientist who's unknown to archaeology. I am relying on the leading figures in different groups of collaborative researchers who have converged on the same kinds of conclusions. Kevin Lalland, in this slide, is an evolutionary biologist. In origin, he's a biologist. He's at St. Andrews University, not very far from where I am. And his research over more than 2 decades is summarized and expounded in this recent book, Darwin's Unfinished Symphony. And it has converged on the work of Robert Boyd and Joe Henrich, understanding of the importance of human cultural niche construction for the support of cumulative cultural evolution. Lalland, indeed, was one of the architects of niche construction theory back in the end of the 1990s, early 2000s, when he was at Cambridge, and has done fascinating work on the development of cultural niche construction theory. There is a growing body of evidence that larger social groups are better able both to sustain a complex cultural heritage, to innovate, and to incorporate innovations and withstand competition. I'm very happy with the central thesis of both Joe Henrich's and Kevin Lalland's recently published books on the importance of the human facility for cumulative culture. The key features of human cultural and social evolution have been to ensure that the cultural niche has sufficient numbers in the population with sufficient maximum interconnectedness, and that secures what Lalland was in the previous slide calling the ecological inheritance. The larger, the more complex the body of cultural knowledge, ideas, and behaviors, the greater the scale of population that is required to support it, and the greater the need for intensive sociality and connectivity within the population. The developments that we see in our Epipalaeolithic-Neolithic transformation, I think, exemplify Lalland's and Henrich's ideas. But expanding the scale of the social group and sustaining a high degree of connectivity and shared identity comes at a cost. What I want to argue now is that the modes of material symbolism, I think I've slipped a little here, and I can't remember where that's gone. I'll just comment on this particular screen. Here I've put together two thinkers, Andy Clark and Steven Pinker, who both talk about the cognition and culture co-evolutionary feedback as opposed to the gene culture co-evolutionary feedback, emphasizing how language as a kind of self-constructed cognitive niche enables us to materialize the ideas which enable us to think, manipulate them, and so forth. And again, Steven Pinker, a linguist by training, thinks that the co-evolution of intelligence, sociality, and language is the important feature. Sorry, I'm getting muddled up. Let me go on. Andy Clark and Pinker think in terms of language as being the key factor. If we turn to Merlin Donald in this picture, then he distinguishes spoken language from written language and the coming of writing, which he thinks is the third stage in his evolutionary account of culture and cognition, which he calls theoretic culture. And although he was thinking primarily, as a good academic should, in terms of written texts as the medium of storage and transmission of all kinds of knowledge, he also discusses the art and architecture the capacity of art and architecture to serve as shared external symbolic storage. I've assembled these quotations from Donald's work. What he is saying refers to the capacity of humans to make something like Göbekli Tepe a monument to cultural memory. I think of something like the Basilica of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, full of mosaics and frescoes, and how it was built to frame the movements, the gestures, the words, and the emotions and the thinking of those who were involved in the liturgy. It's a co-evolutionary feedback system within, in terms of symbolic material culture, whether in stone or in print, and the essential ideology of a community. And the point I'm wanting to make is that all the effort that people were putting in the Neolithic were putting into making symbolic buildings, symbolic statuary, symbolic signs on things is part of the cost of maintaining a large-scale human society. So the expansion of the society is what culture wants, but it comes at a cost. So we have a general cultural niche construction outline of human evolution, which makes it clear that the scale of population units and the interconnectedness of those members are critically important features. And I'm arguing that we can apply those arguments to the crescendo of developments that we see through the Epipalaeolithic and Neolithic. Communities in parts of Southwest Asia evolved new ways of community building and new kinds of community that enabled larger populations to live permanently together. And those communities, through some of their individuals, were socially and culturally highly interconnected with one another in regional super communities. This expansion in the scale of the cultural cognitive niche came at a cost. The demands of forming such extensive networks of large-scale permanent communities were paid in terms of the new and expensive modes of collective memory building. The new forms of expensive investment in material culture, including the monumental architecture and symbolic sculpture, enabled people to share and experience their collective identities as very large-scale social groups, the prototype world in which people learn to live comfortably, as Paul Seabright says, in the company of strangers. The changes in society, in culture, and in the economic basis of society that characterize the Neolithic represent a rapid transformation away from the world of the Paleolithic mobile bands into a new world. I would characterize what emerged as the first large-scale societies, permanently co-resident societies, formed on the back of a demographic explosion and supported by delayed return subsistence strategies that over time developed into what we know as farming economies. And that was all accompanied by extensive diversification and expansion of complex material and non-material culture. The Epipalaeolithic-Neolithic transformation represents an upscaling of the scale and tempo of human cultural and social evolution, resetting the parameters for the future trajectory of human history towards our own times. So the insights of non-archaeologists like Daniel Lord-Smale and Paul Seabright should encourage those of us who work on the Epipalaeolithic and Neolithic in Southwest Asia. We've got plenty to talk about. We should be equally encouraged by the work of leading evolutionary biologists, evolutionary anthropologists, evolutionary psychologists, and philosophers. They are seeing human cultural evolution over deep time in new and exciting ways. And when some of them see the Neolithic era as the fulcrum of the great transformation, we should be ready to respond by showing just how much we have learned about that remarkable transformation. What may appear to others to be just a moment in remote prehistory was in fact a time of momentous transformation. Whatever aspect we happen to be interested in, we should at the same time be aware that it's part of a whole transformation, and we should be confident that we're making an important contribution to the deeper understanding of a great transformational moment in the human story. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Now I'm going to unshare. Where's the button going to unshare? There we go. Okay.
Thank you very much, Trevor. It was very good for framing, drawing, and the theoretical perspective of neolithization. We were planning to chat question and answering, but you can ask directly. You can all open the camera and the microphone now. And yes. Hi everyone again.
Hello. So I was going to read the questions to you, Trevor, but now I think we don't have any written ones, right? So why not everybody just asks his or her questions directly to you, if it's okay, if you accept.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, listen to the questions. Whether I can give answers is another matter.
Okay. So any questions?
Well, I have a question, and thank you very much for
Anna,
the.
Anna, I won't, because I said Anna will ask the first questions.
I'm glad you won. Somebody will be happy. Anyway, or whichever way it goes. What I wanted to ask you, and thank you very much, Trevor. It was really a tour de force, and I'm really very appreciative. I wanted to ask you, though, about one of the slides that you showed and the reference to Dunbar. Can you expand a little bit of how much you embrace of Dunbar's, let's say, hypothesis, and how you see it applicable to the Neolithic?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that Dunbar began his work that we know of his work in the 1990s, which is now almost 30 years ago, evolutionary theory has changed quite a lot in that time. So he was very concerned with the brain and the mind, yeah, humans and all our predecessors in the hominin evolutionary scale have had brains which are much larger than are needed for the size of humans. Yeah, so it's quite clear that over 2 or 3 million years, quite rapidly, the hominin brain has expanded very, very rapidly beyond what is needed for the change in the size of human bodies. And what he was looking for was the relationship between the complexity of the brain and the social group. And so studying or picking up all sorts of information about different primate species, he's able to say that primates that live in small groups where it's not too difficult for the members of the group to get on with each other and know about each other, they have relatively small brains. Bigger brains come with bigger and more complex primate societies. So he's fitting the human brain and the human mind to that story. He then, in the early 2000s, he got together with Clive Gamble, the Paleolithic prehistorian, and another colleague who was also a prehistoric archaeologist, a Paleolithic specialist at Liverpool University, which is where he was. And they set up this Lucy to Language project, yeah, which focused a little bit more on not just the size of brain and the complexity of the brain structure, but also on the evolution of language and communication. Yeah, so he's much more concerned with that. Where that relates to what we might be interested in is that he is saying that there's a relationship between what human minds have learned to do and the scale of society, social group in which they operate. Yeah, and I think this is something which is quite important in our Neolithic period, because we're seeing in the Neolithic period, or in the Epipalaeolithic-Neolithic, a complete change in the scale of the human social group. Yeah, But interestingly, we're not seeing any change in brain size. Yeah, it's a purely cultural process. So by the time we're getting into the 2000s, and particularly beyond 2010, the last decade or so, what has been coming out, and you may have noticed this in the titles and subtitles of the 3 books that I had by on the screen by Joe Henrich, Kevin Lalland, and Robert Boyd. They all talk about how culture is what makes us smart. Yeah, not brain size, not brain function, but how culture makes us smart. So over the last decade or so, there's been a transfer, and Dunbar's kind of thinking has got a bit left behind, if you like. He's tried to keep up, and what was the last publication that they produced from the Lucida Language Project? Thinking Big. A book called Thinking Big was the last book that they produced after the end of the project. And interestingly, the lead author in that is Clive Gamble, the archaeologist. Yeah? And some of the ideas about brain and so forth have gone into the background. Yeah, and it's about social group size, cohesion, and how culture enables us to do that. So Dunbar's ideas have changed over time. I used it as a starting point because he was very popular in the 1990s. He had in Britain and North America, had very popular books. And there's even a thing called Dunbar's number, that the modern human brain of Homo sapiens has the capacity to deal with 150 people and be able to manipulate in memory, mind, the relationships amongst them up to 150 people. But what we've done beyond that is purely cultural. Yeah, how we've learned to live in communities of hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, even millions with difficulty is a cultural phenomenon, not a function of the brain. So he's got a bit left behind.
Thank you.
You wouldn't like to hear me say that.
So there's a good questions from Juano. Juan, do you want to ask yourself that question? You already.
Okay, no, it's written. It's about hi Trevor. Thank you very much for your talk. You translated Coban's book 25 years ago. And my question is about what do you think from our current knowledge? What do you think about the symbolic shift as an element provoking this transition to farming? Or what's your current opinion?
Well, I think I put it in print somewhere that the reason I was interested in undertaking that translation was because I read the book in French, and it was splendid, but I didn't understand it. And I thought that if I sat down with it sentence by sentence and paragraph by paragraph, I would penetrate Jacques' thinking and understand what he was driving at. Yeah, he was writing in essentially, although it was a late edition of the book, which was translated into English, he was writing in the early 1990s. So he didn't know anything about people like, the cultural evolutionists. Yeah, he's depending on his ideas, his knowledge of European philosophy of the late 19th, early 20th century. And very, very sadly, after we'd finished the translation and sorted out the details with him for the Cambridge University Press edition, I was looking forward to saying, okay, Jacques, now I'll come back and I want to ask you all the questions. Yeah, where does this idea come from? How do you make sense of this? But of course, he had a massive stroke and he was beyond reach, and there was never that opportunity to see. What Jacques' book did was provoke an enormous amount of thinking. And what he, of course, noticed was this burst of symbolic material activity, which is in the begins in the Epipalaeolithic, but it really takes off in the early pre-pottery Neolithic. So he had grasped something, really quite important. When he says that it precedes agriculture, of course, he was actually not paying a great deal of attention to the work of his botanist colleague, who was identifying pre-domesticated domestication agriculture in the early Neolithic, but certainly it precedes farming. Yeah? And that was the point he really wanted to make, that there's something much more important going on in that period than, but I think he is only pointing us the way, that as Miraban mentioned, was it Anna's Miraban, from a paper that I wrote a long while ago, that he opened the door and pointed the way, but sadly he left us and we weren't able to. I would love to have known what he would have made of the, all the material that was beginning to appear during the 1990s and really became a flood in the early 2000s, about cultural and social evolution, and whether he would have whether he would have criticized that, or whether he would have adopted it, whether he would have seen how to use it. We should never know, I'm afraid.
Okay. Thank you. Juanjo? Any reply? No.
No. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So, Güneş, I think Ian Kite likes to ask something. I don't see him, by the way.
I can see him.
Okay, so please.
He's probably in Canada.
Yeah, but I don't see him.
Really? This is Ian. So you can't
Hi,
see.
Ian, good to see you.
Here.
Trevor, great to see you. Hello to everybody. It's delightful to see all these faces. Sorry, you can't see mine. I'm not quite sure.
Oh,
why
I can
it
good to
is.
see you.
No, we do.
Oh, you can. All right, great.
Now we do.
So, Trevor, thank you very much. I want to take things in a slightly different direction here and respond to what you're putting forth in some ways as your major call to arms, which I applaud, and which is really thinking about, in some ways, our interface as an academy with the general public, and in some ways thinking about the aspect that we as archaeologists and as scholars, we're narrators of the past. We are these wonderfully rare individuals that serve as temporary custodians of knowledge and try and provide narrations of the past. We are ultimately, in some ways, we are storytellers. And I say that in a good way, not a bad way. So here's the question, more of a comment on my part, thinking about perhaps eliciting a comment from you. And that is, I concur that we are not always great as storytellers. And in some ways, part of it is that we are trained in different ways, not only in terms of material culture, culture history, but increasingly, I really am struck how our skill sets, our ways of communication are becoming antiquated and prehistoric in the context of we write books, we write articles, we write about the kind of descriptive work that we need to do. But it is a matter that when we think in terms of the interface with the public, increasingly it's through the internet, and it's increasingly in terms of people that put together films and other things. If one goes and punches in Göbekli Tepe and looks for YouTube clips, what one sees exactly, what I can see from your hand action, you know where we're going. It's not our narrations of the past of an archaeologist taking somebody around. It is these alternate universe presentations that sometimes the aliens show up and sometimes it's somebody else. So I guess that's one of the concerns I have. And I guess I just wanted to hear whether you see that as also a challenge as we try and serve this role as narrators of the past.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got reasons to gesticulate about Göbekli Tepe today for a particular reason. I on the Ancient Origins website, which is looked at by hundreds of thousands of people, there's a piece about Göbekli Tepe, which is really just a few paragraphs, which leads into really effectively the advertisement for a book, yeah, about the gods and the temples and aliens and so forth, yeah, by someone who is a professional writer who likes to put down the archaeologists because the archaeologists don't understand what they've got. Therefore, they talk about their kind of nitty gritty, silly things, yeah, and they won't, you know, can't go to the big story. I'll give you the big story. So I think it's a real problem. It's what I was saying at the beginning, right at the beginning of the lecture. If we don't tell the story, then we leave it to others to do it for us. Yeah, and I think Göbekli Tepe is a prime example of a disaster. Yeah, where the archaeologists have not managed to put over the narrative, not been able to tell the story. Yeah, they can't agree amongst themselves for one thing. But I think there's another problem. And I can say this because I'm a lot older than you, Ian. But over the decades, the number of people involved in working on the prehistory of Southwest Asia has grown and grown and grown. Yeah, so that now you can have conferences not just on the stone tool technology, yeah, but you can have little workshops and conferences that publish about the botany or the zoology or whatever. Yeah. And really, we're talking to each other, yeah. And all the articles we publish in great journals like Palaeolithic and so forth, we're talking to each other, yeah. And we're not recognizing. You're absolutely right. We're not realizing that we should be also talking to the rest of the world, yeah. Because we've got some great stuff, yeah. We've got some great stuff, but we're not putting it over very well.
I think there's another dimension to this here, Trevor, and that is, I think in some ways this is also embodied in a dimension of the tension between science and pseudoscience, and essentially how is knowledge created. And I think that's a friction point that essentially, who are the authorities? Who are the narrators of the past? And in some ways, technology and the internet has facilitated these conversations in a way that sense of what is data, what is science in some form, that's being bypassed by by individuals in a way that have basically create not only this sense of challenge for us to communicate, but also to try and say, wait, this is a bigger debate, and there are ways under which we know what we know.
Yeah, this was beginning to happen before I retired from teaching, which is quite a few years ago, more than 12 years ago when I retired. But I can remember in the last years that I was teaching, I realized that I got to start talking to students about finding reading material. And I realized that throughout my career as a student, and then as a researcher, and then as a teacher, I could rely on the fact that the university library had a vetting system. Yeah, that the books that it had been recommended by someone. Yeah, they didn't go and look across the shelves or respond to the advertisements and buy books off the open market. Yeah, they accumulated books which were recommended to them by the academics in the institution. And the learned journals also had a vetting system. You know, if you or I submit an article, even 20, 30 years ago, it was looked at very carefully to see whether this was appropriate and should be published. The internet just changed that completely. Yeah, within 5 years. Yeah, and it just gets bigger and bigger, obviously. And I've done one or two lectures and things with groups of people who've been curious. Again, it's Göbekli Tepe mostly. I mean, curious about Göbekli Tepe and gods and temples. Yeah. And it's really quite interesting to talk to them because they're very enthusiastic about what they've found. But what they've found and what they've learned is essentially off the internet and pseudoscience books. Yeah. And to explain to them how the archaeology has become transferred and transmuted, yeah, into the pseudoscience and leaving the opportunities open to these writers of pseudoscience books is quite an interesting exercise. But a lot of people don't have the critical ability to differentiate between a pseudoscience popular book and something which is real. Yeah. But on the other hand, there are not many books that are real that would be helpful to the general public.
Moritz, do you want to say something? Do you want to say something?
What should I say about this? It's always kind of difficult to transfer a narrative. At least I could say what we tried with another site, not Göbekli Tepe. It might be in the planning, but like for reaching out to a completely different audience, we produce in the last years now a graphic novel to present the results from Shkert Mesayed. And it's just published, and I can share the link with you in the chat if you're interested. And this is just a way of where you also have to question yourself as an archaeologist, because you have to solve all the questions you normally avoid to answer. So how did people look like? How did people interact with each other actually? Who is taking responsibility in an action? So if you try to tell a story about an archaeological site as a narrative in this sense, you have to question completely different questions to yourself. And in the sense also, when you look at Göbekli Tepe, you could easily imagine a kind of a graphic novel and putting all these crazy interpretations on one page together, on how it will look like. And it's probably then like a splatter movie more than, like Ian would say. And you have various diverse views on the same site in the same moment. And it's not easy to kind of then go back to the actual archaeological findings and finds you have to build slowly up your kind of interpretational view from scratch somehow, because you're burdened by narratives you have to carry and to might be counteract, because they are getting a research opinion instead of actual proof of a story.
What you remind me is of a long time ago. I was asked to be on a national committee for it was called research assessment exercise. The government had insisted that the universities undertook these research assessment exercises, which assessed the quality of research done in different departments at different universities. And we were all graded 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 being the top grade. And if you grade 5, you got a lot of money. If you grade 1, you got no money. I can remember being on this national committee, and all the archaeologists in all the archaeology departments had put together their big publications, their best publications over the last 5 years between one exercise and the next. Yeah, and each department submitted its corpus. Our people have published this, and this. And there was all sorts of debate in the group. And the general feeling, and this made me very concerned, the general feeling was that the big monographs, which had multiple authors, particularly something which is a monograph of a report of 5 years of excavation, where there's chapters by 15 different people and appendices by 20 more, but the main excavator's name is on the spine, is on the cover. Yeah, that is the acme. That is the great. And writing a book for the public, particularly if it was written for children, counted 0. And I thought this was wrong, because I don't know whether if anybody who's tried, you will have just done this, Moritz, if you're working with this. When you start to write for a wide public and not for archaeology students or your fellow archaeologists, it's actually the most difficult writing you can do, I think. Do you agree?
I would say fully agreed, because this is the literature I would say might be most people would be attracted to, but you are not accounted for, and especially not in our academic system nowadays.
No.
Absolutely.
No. And it's quite wrong, because it's not only the most difficult thing to do, but it has the biggest impact.
Yeah.
Yeah, it has the biggest impact. There.
Okay, and I think Chilar has a question. Chilar, do you want to ask yourself directly to Trevor?
Yeah, I've written it down. Now, I was just wondering about the this cultural evolutionary theories that are obviously postulate universal sort of rules. What makes Southwest Asian Neolithic different from all the other Neolithics or all the other Homo sapiens populations who did not necessarily go and invent farming or become sedentary? So there must be some sort of a historical particularity about Southwest Asian Neolithic that goes beyond perhaps this more universal ways of looking at Homo sapiens, you know, brain size and population density, etc.
Yeah, well, we were told when we were students, you know, how Southwest Asia, the Near East, as it was called when I was a student, how that was the first, yeah. And yes, there are other places, but they're so far behind, yeah. And that's not true, because we now know that there were sedentary societies moving towards cultivation and into farming in China only 1,000 or so years later, in Central America, in South America, yeah. Again, not so very far behind, yeah, in time, yeah. So yes, it's the earliest, but it's not the earliest by more than 2,000 or 3,000 years. And 2,000 or 3,000 years in 100,000 years or 200,000 years of Homo sapiens is pretty small. I've always thought that the person who had a really simple handle on this was Jared Diamond. Do you know the book Guns, Germs, and Steel? Yeah. Okay, he's a you know, he writes great popular science, yeah. But what he realized about Southwest Asia was that it had a unique combination of potential domesticate animals and potential domesticate crops, much larger than anywhere else in the world, yeah. Yeah. So that if things begin to take off in Southwest Asia, yeah, then they're going to go faster and quicker probably than elsewhere, simply because the potential is just so great, yeah, and so varied. And the other thing I'd say is that Homo sapiens have been there for quite a long time. Homo sapiens didn't get to the Americas, yeah, until shortly before Donald Trump. No, shortly before 15,000 BC, yeah. But within quite a short time after people had populated most of the Americas, then they began to become sedentary and began to cultivate in very much the same way. There's not such a big gap in time now if you put those the starts together. Yeah. So I think it's happened in something like 7 different parts of the world, not simultaneously. But why should it happen simultaneously? Yeah, it wasn't a race. Nobody was going to get a big cup for winning. Yeah, they were entirely independent processes, but I think they're going down the same trajectory. Yeah, in that they're leading. If you want to go beyond Neolithic and beyond the beginning of farming, they're all leading to the emergence of large-scale civilizations and states. Whether it's China or whether it's the Americas, the only part of the Americas which fails is North America. Yeah, Central America and South America manages it. It begins in North America in the eastern states, but it comes to an end. And I don't think Ian Kite will know much more about this than I. But I don't think it comes to an end in North America because of the arrival of Europeans. I think it's already faded. And it didn't work for some reason in the Mississippian area. Yeah, is that a reasonable thing to say, Ian?
Yeah. So what I understand it was inevitable that in different parts of the world people would go Neolithic. When you said North America, I was thinking about the Californian hunter-gatherers who were living very happily without doing much farming. And is it okay to say they were gonna go and start food production at some point if the Europeans did not arrive? So can we actually say something so deterministic like this? That was my question, but thank you.
But Chilla, I don't think it's farming. I don't think farming is the criteria. Farming is or the possession of domesticated plants and animals or plants is something which can be determined if you've got the botanical evidence. Yeah. But I don't think that farming is the crucial thing. I think it is becoming large-scale communities and it becomes easier if you're sedentary, yeah, because then you've got the opportunity for contacts at any time. You don't have to think, oh, the guy who can teach me how to make a harpoon is 500 miles away at the moment in the Arctic, yeah. he's just 10 houses away. Yeah.
Makes all the difference.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think it's that there was a unique combination of circumstances in Southwest Asia, and one of the circumstances was the early arrival of Homo sapiens.
Okay.
I think, but I don't understand quite how that works. But Homo sapiens have been there quite a long time, yeah, and had plenty of opportunity to find out, what the potentials were.
Thank you so much, Trevor. Great to
Good to see you again, Chile.
Eleni says,
And I do appreciate how you are color-coded and toned with your furniture as well. I think
that was not intentional.
Dinesh, do we have time for one more question?
yeah, we have time for several questions, but
Okay.
before the Eleni's questions, Eleni also says, Trevor, the botanical evidence is strongly protesting your.
Eleni says what?
Yeah,
Where-
botanical evidence is strongly protesting and smiling.
Where's Eleni? Maybe Eleni likes to join.
Yes.
Hi, Trevor. I love your talk.
Hi.
I was just wanting to pull your leg a little bit about the botanical evidence, but I am not suggesting that we should talk botanical evidence right now. I feel much chastened, especially after Ian Kite's thesis about making our arguments a bit more accessible. This is not obviously the place to start debating the finer details. But I would like to ask you the question about history, which I've put on chat. I mean, following up from Ziller's intervention, how do we bridge the gap, if you want, between evolution and the longue durée and history? It remains a fact. I mean, all archaeologists stare at this fact in their trenches, under their microscopes in the labs, and so on, that there are strong, not just regional, but even areal differences between what we call the Neolithic way of life.
Okay.
And this is what we as archaeologists are best equipped to reconstruct, to begin with, piecing together these regional, aerial histories. I got a feeling while listening to your talk that it is sometimes very easy, very tempting to employ or to align, to adhere to a single theoretical framework that goes by the name of niche construction theory or, cognitive evolution and so on. But don't these arguments are in a way resulting into circular research questions, if you want, and hypotheses? If you really look for something, you're going to find it and you're going to fit all your details into that. But how then do we account for what I call history, the historical detail, how these things came to be?
Well, I think go back to Daniel Lord Smale and his book on deep history that I showed in the lecture. I think he ducks it, yeah, because he tells the story which comes right the way through to modern history in a very interesting way, but in a single thread, yeah. And it is how humans have learned to manipulate the consciousness of others or themselves, yeah. And so sometimes it's communication, and then later on it's alcohol, and then it's an interesting book. But he's trying something on. But what is much more interesting, really, is the book which he collaborated on with Shryock, and I'm trying to remember the title. It's a really interesting book, and I've lost. I can't see it on my shelves. It should be somewhere quite close to me. But it's in the big book on deep time. Smale and Shryock got together a number of people, and one of them I'm pretty sure is Steiner. Another is Clive Gamble, and I can't remember. Timothy Earle is another archaeologist, yeah. And then various people in other different disciplines, and they're put together in different teams, and they're given the task of writing the whole of human history, in a way, in one way or another. And of course, it's quite challenging. But some of those chapters are really quite interesting. The way that these little teams of 3 or 4 people have come up with a way of framing the whole of human history. Yeah? And someone else who's done quite a lot on that is a man called Peter Turchin, who's particularly interested in civilization and the common factors which enable you to talk about the whole of the history of all civilizations. Yeah? But none of these people, of course, will come down to the kind of history which we're familiar with, where, you know, it's the First World War or something, and there are lots of individuals concerned, you know, the heads of government and the foreign secretaries and the generals and so forth. Yeah. And we tend to think of history in terms of singular human agents. Yeah. But I'm not sure that you can explain, for example, that there's been quite a lot of work here, and you may in Britain about the First World War because of the anniversaries. And I'm not sure that you could explain the history of the First World War in terms of the interaction between various heads of government and governments and members of governments and generals and so forth. I don't think that enables you to understand it fully. There's a missing bit. Most modern history is told as personal tales. Yeah, it's about Henry VIII or the Habsburgs or the industrial. Well, yeah, about this or that. But it's told as stories of important people and the role they have in the making of history. But I'm not sure that that is entirely explains what's happening. They make nice stories to read. Historians write some very nice books for us to read, but and we can be very satisfied with what we read. But I'm not sure that we actually understand why those things happened as they did, because we've been introduced to some of the people. So I think that we're still waiting to see how to bring the story right the way through to historical times. It can certainly be brought through to the early proto-historical times. You'll get it, you know, the rise of urban civilization in Mesopotamia, the rise of big kingdoms like Egypt, the rise of large-scale cultures in Mesoamerica or whatever. You can come through to ancient civilizations, but whether you can get through to Greece and Rome and on to recent civilizations, I think is still to be tested. And of course, historians don't like having their role undermined by people who talk about evolution and things. It's not very helpful. But they don't know much about botany either, Eleni, so they're not very, they're not worth bothering with.
Okay. So I think Anna has written a beautiful interpretation, which can be the final words of the session, maybe. Would you like to read that or
Well,
tell
I think
by yourself?
I think I made the grammatical mistake, but what I'm referring to, and it comes back to Ian's question and the response of Trevor, is that our weakness as archaeologists, I would say actually on each account, is that we keep on borrowing from all other disciplines. I mean, Trevor put it on one of his first slides, but he himself kept borrowing and not borrowing, but presenting the evolution of, let's say, the archaeological interpretation of the new data through things said by brain experts, by philologists, by philosophers. It's not that I'm against doing it, on the contrary, but on the other hand, I think that we as archaeologists are still not standing firm enough on our legs to create, let's say, dogmas of our own. So, I mean, if you go through the names that you put on your in your slides, it's like amazing, really. The number of archaeologists there are really, I mean, they are nearly non-existent, except of Gamble and the last, what was Robertson, and
Yes.
all the rest are guys from elsewhere. And the thing is that they are really, in a way, influencing very much our own thinking about the stuff that we are exposing, like Eleni was saying, what we see in our trenches. And I think that we have to reach some kind of maturity as archaeologists to manage, to turn around and contribute something of our own to all those disciplines, instead of constantly borrowing ways and means from them, which kind of channel how we see things. I think Eleni said something to that effect, that we accept some dogma and then we try to fit in our evidence into it. And it's difficult. I mean, I'm not inventing the wheel, and Louis Bigford wrote the same thing years ago, I think in the early 80s, when he stated that archaeology has she's not full-fledged discipline to a degree because it keeps borrowing from other disciplines, which is very good as long as you yourself have a core as an archaeologist.
Yeah, I think the difficulty we have, Anna, if we want to collaborate with the theoretical cultural evolutionists who've been working over the last 20, 30 years, the authors of some of those books that I put up in slides, they're working in the long term, yeah? They're working on long-term human evolution. Our little window seems to them to be impossibly recent, yeah? And they don't know much about it, yeah? And somehow we have to persuade them that what is happening in this, for them, very late prehistory, beyond the upper Paleolithic, beyond the human revolution and all these kind of Paleolithic things, what is happening then is actually very important if you're to understand what comes beyond that time, yeah? I would say that I did enjoy working very much with Kim Sterelny. There's an article in Cambridge Archaeological Journal, which Kim and I co-authored, yeah? And working with Kim on preparing that was great, yeah? Was really interesting. And since then, he's gone on to talk about the Neolithic, in various things he's written, and he gets read much more widely. So, there's one person who's been to the Neolithic, yeah? And has co-authored with an archaeologist in later prehistory, and has taken away from that and is now using that, what he's learned in things that he's doing wider. But it's the difficulty of persuading, I think, the people who have been concerned with the mechanisms of long-term cultural evolution, that this particular window that we're interested in is really worth looking at, yeah, is really worth their attention, yeah. But unless we make the point to them, yeah, and I've got articles in various places which probably a number of archaeologists won't have seen, yeah, where it's really quite interesting, the number of people who notice things in journals which have nothing to do with archaeology at all, yeah. I think but we do need to get out there and work with them and get into dialogue with them, yeah. I'm not sure that we could come up with an interpretation and an understanding of the process which is totally unique to the Neolithic. If it's unique to the Neolithic, it's not going to be very helpful to the wider world, to people who are interested in earlier prehistory, later prehistory, or whatever, yeah. It has to be something which fits into a general view of how history happens, yeah.
Yeah, but we can change a lot, I can tell you, and it wasn't by fluke that I asked you about Dunbar, because according to Dunbar, like you were saying, up to very late in prehistory, you had to live in small groups. Otherwise, I mean, your mind would boggle and you couldn't stay in a larger company than 150 people. While in archaeology nowadays, there is quite a lot of evidence going on that humans in the Paleolithic, I'm not talking about the Neolithic, were living in much bigger groups. So actually we can, as archaeologists, and that's just one example, I don't want to continue this with so many people taking up all the time, but we can go turn around and tell Dunbar, your theory is very nice, but we as archaeologists have proved to show that it doesn't work that way, so come up with something different. I mean the interaction, I think that we contribute less to all those big theories than we get from them. And it's not only being on equal terms, it's also that we shy away. It's more accepted by archaeologists to accept these big visions and big theories. And we kind of try to fit in our data, like I'm repeating myself, into those concepts instead of trying to say, hey, something is wrong there. I think we're a bit too shy in a way, or not sure about being a proper discipline, you know, with dogmas and theories and standing on our own feet.
Yes, okay, you're right. But if you want to show that there's things which Dunbar and his colleagues have missed, yeah, and haven't properly understood, and in their last book, Thinking Big, they do try to get into the Neolithic actually, and there are even references in some of the chapters to articles that I've written. So you know they've got onto some of the good stuff, but I don't think they've really understood it. But if we want to say, yeah, we can improve your understanding, there's things which you haven't understood, we've got to put it in a forum where they're going to read it, and the people who are already persuaded that these are the best people with the best ideas, where they also read it, yeah, and talking to each other